Terrific. Thank you. Well, as someone once quipped, this is deja vu all over again. Riding over with Stephen and Christy this morning, we were just reminiscing about the time that Tim called me about coming to North Texas and my refusal. I wasn't going to move, and Tim was persistent about that, and we allowed them to come up. In fact, he said, think about it a little bit, and he called me back, and I said, well, we thought about it. We're not going to move. Tim said, well, we sell ourselves better in person. Said, one of our elders owns an airplane. We'll just fly to Kansas City and talk to you. Now, how many churches and elders say that? I mean, like nobody. And so they came, and we had barbecue Kansas City style, and got to meet them, and were impressed with what they said that we could possibly be of benefit. And we showed up, and it was a great 2 years. And they were very gracious in understanding some of the goals that we had in terms of ministry. And we feel very blessed and very fortunate that we got to enjoy the 2 years here with you, brethren. And thank you, shepherds, for inviting me back. When you preach at a place and they never have you back, you kind of wonder if you left on a sour note. But when they invite you back, you feel good about that everything is good. So we appreciate that so very much. When we left here, and this was our goal, to spend some time traveling full time, and to use that in terms of ministry opportunities that we could be able to share the gospel. So in 2018, when we left here, we went to Canada and spent the summer and worked with some churches in Ontario. And for some almost 3 years, we traveled the United States. We were in 36 states and 10 countries during that period, and 48 different congregations. And so it was a real special time for us to be able to do that, and to meet a lot of brethren along the way, and to preach the gospel. One of the places, in fact, Stephen asked me on the way this morning what our favorite place was where we have traveled, and there are a lot of places that we've really enjoyed being in churches. I say in terms of a city and a situation that we enjoyed was when we were in Athens, Greece. And one of the reasons for the idea of that being one of our favorite, there's a lot of Bible history there. We was able to go up on Mars Hill where Paul preached, and it's recorded in Acts 17. In fact, and some of you may have been there, at the base where you go up, there's a plaque with his sermon there on Acts 17. And to be able to go up there and to be where Paul was, and to walk around that and be able to look across and see the Parthenon and the Temple of Athena, and know that Paul condemned idolatry standing on that very spot, really does something to you. It's just an incredible thing. And then one of the things that we did was to be able to go to the Olympic Stadium. And before everything was built up, probably on Paul's day, probably from Mars Hill, he could see the stadium. And that's a pretty unique stadium. It was built in the 4th century BC, and then it was rebuilt in 144 BC in marble. The only stadium in the world that is built entirely of marble. And then it fell into disrepair later, and was excavated and restored in 1869. And they hosted the Olympics there in 1870. And the first modern Olympics, as we think about modern Olympics today, was hosted in this very stadium in 1896. But that stadium would have been there when Paul was in Athens. And I wonder if Paul ever went to that stadium. I don't know. We don't know. Did he ever go there and see a race or some of the marathons or the Olympics? He may very well have. But regardless of that fact, we know the Apostle Paul employed the language of a runner many, many times as he wrote his various epistles. And one of those is going to be the theme for our study this morning in the book of Philippians in chapter 3. And the Apostle Paul there says, not that I've already attained or have already been perfected, that I press on, that I may lay hold of that for which Jesus Christ also has laid hold of me. Brethren, I do not count myself to have apprehended, but this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to those things which are ahead, I press toward to go over the prize the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. And so that's going to be our theme this week as we think about pressing toward the prize. And I think it's important for us to remember the fact that the Apostle Paul was an aged man when he wrote this. He was not a young man in the prime of his life, but he was coming toward the end. And for many of us that are in the room this morning, we are maybe coming to or around the fourth turn of the stadium. Others of you are just getting started and haven't even reached the first turn yet, and some are maybe heading toward the second. We're all in different places in our lives as we run the Christian race. But regardless of that, whether you're a teenager that's a young Christian, or whether you're in your 70s or 80s, or maybe even 90s, I don't know, you're running the race. And we're all seeking to run the very best that we can. So our lessons this week really want to focus around that idea of pressing toward the prize, because we all have that in common, regardless of our age or maturity level or how long that we've been a Christian. And so this first lesson in the Bible study hour is kind of a keynote lesson to lay the stage and for us to think about this idea of pressing toward the prize. There are four things that I want to notice that I think will help us in that regard and lay a foundation for the following lessons. The first thing is the Apostle Paul was devoted in his preaching and teaching of the gospel. He was devoted to running the Christian race. Devotion, of course, involves the idea of allegiance, of attachment, of dedication, of deference, of faithfulness, of fidelity, and of fervor. Douglas V. Steere, who was a 20th century philosopher, wrote this about devotion. He said, "Devotion is not a thing that passes, that comes and goes, as it were, but it is something habitual. It is fixed and permanent, that extends over every instance of life and regulates our conduct." Religiously, it is possible for us to be dedicated and devoted, and yet for our devotion to be misguided and misplaced. One writer put it this way: Christianity is not devotion to work or to a cause or a doctrine, but devotion to a person, the Lord Jesus Christ. And when you read the book of Philippians, it is obvious to us that Paul's devotion was Christ-centered. In these 4 short chapters, Christ is mentioned 38 times. And it is summed up, I think, by the statement here in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 21, where he said, "For me to live is Christ." And so Paul ran the Christian race with his eyes upon Jesus. He declared in that text we just read, "This one thing I do." The one thing that he did was his devotion and his dedication and his focus on who Jesus was and the preaching and teaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I was reminded when I was thinking about this point of a statement that was made by the author Stephen Covey, and he's credited with saying that the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. That's often applied in business and in different secular pursuits, but it's certainly important in Christianity. Paul's one thing was his main thing. His life began with Christ. His faith was based on Christ. His ministry was built around Christ. And his hope was buoyed by Christ. And so when Christ is our focus, then our academic endeavors, our professions, our hobbies, our families, and obviously the work of the Lord's church is built around a devotion to Christ. And so as we think this week about pressing toward the prize, it must begin with this kind of Christ-centered devotion that we are completely dedicated and devoted to Him. The second thing I want to talk about as we think about this is direction. Now I might ask the sound booth and the AV people back there, is it possible for you to put my PowerPoint on this little screen or not? If it is, that would be great. I'm going to talk to you in the next hour a little bit about pressing toward heaven and how we're all getting just a little bit older. And one of the things may be your eyesight. Your eyesight begins, not to be quite as good. And so I need this to be able to see on the screen back there, Cody, in about 72 font. And I've only got it in about 40 font. So anyway, so that'll help me out the rest of the time. I realized I got through that passage and I hadn't forwarded because I couldn't see the screen. Well, I can see the screen, I just couldn't read everything. Oh, that's so good. Cody, you're the man. All right, appreciate it. All right, now we're cooking. Direction. I'm glad I gave him direction to do that. You know, there is a quote by the late great Hall of Fame New York Yankee catcher Yogi Berra. And Yogi, as you may remember, was famous not only for his on-the-field heroics, but also his funny quips off the field that became known as Yogiisms. Yogi had this one, he says, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. You think about that. But here's one that kind of fits where we're going here. He says, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. Well, that's true. And you got to know where you're going. You need to know where you're headed, because if you don't have the right kind of spiritual direction, you're definitely going to end up somewhere that you don't want to be. And so the idea here of reaching forward, and so in the text here, Paul said, they're forgetting the things which are behind. I'm reaching forward to the things that are before. It is easy for us, if we're not careful, to spend too much time in the past, of thinking about the things that are behind us and about the past. I'm going to talk more about that in another lesson when we talk about some of the obstacles that we face. But we need to think about reaching forward. The idea of reaching forward here is a word that was used to describe the runner that was going hard for the tape. I won't even try to pronounce it in Greek. Maybe Ben knows Greek a little better than I do, but it's a great big old long word. And some of the versions talk about straining toward the goal or stretching toward the goal. But it carries with it this picture. And this comes from the Paris Olympics. And if you watched any of the Olympics, you saw many of these races, not just 100 meters sprints, but some even the longer races that you would come down just toward the last few feet. And as it come down toward the tape, you couldn't hardly tell who won. I'd be watching it on a big screen TV, and I'm scratching back, who won that race? And it was a photo finish. And as you see that there they are, their bodies are angled forward, their arms are reaching out. And as they come around that fourth turn, you can always see how that their muscles are straining and their legs are stretched and they're pumping it with everything they've got. As we'd say, they're going flat out for the finish line. That's the word that's used there. You say, you mean all of that is in one word? Yeah. That's the word that they used of runners that were in that kind of situation. And so as Christians, see, we're not just taking a stroll in the park. We're not just kind of walking behind our wife in the mall, kind of waiting to when this shopping thing is done and so forth. We're sprinting. We're pressing. We're stretching. We're straining. We're giving it everything that we've got. And we're not looking backwards. You don't see, the only one I can ever think of in modern times, Usain Bolt, was so good that occasionally as you come toward the tape, you can't glance over at the people that he left in his dust. He was incredible. But he didn't do that but like once. A good runner, you don't see a good runner looking over his shoulder. I talked to one of the cross-country boys in Debo last night. Don't look back. I think that's another one Yogi said, don't look back, someone may be gaining on you. But anyway, you keep going. You press toward the goal. You press toward the finish line. And a good runner is not looking over his shoulder, looking back. That'll slow you down. And so you forget the past. You can't live in the past. You can't change the past. You can't be defined by the past. You can't look back to past regrets and past sins and past mistakes. You've got to keep pressing forward toward the finish line. And so we're looking forward. We're looking forward to our mission, to our ministry, and to sharing our message that we are not finished yet. Christian runners must keep their spiritual eyes focused on the future. And as the Apostle Paul put it in another passage in Hebrews 12, he said, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. And so it's almost like this picture that here's Jesus at the finish line. And we can see, through the eye of faith, we can see the finish line up there. You know, our little 10-year-old grandson, Miles, just run cross country at his school for the first time. And of course, some of you remember Kenny's a runner, and he coached cross country at FC for 10 years. And so, of course, Kenny's all over the course. He knows the different spots, and so he's running to meet Miles at a certain point, and he's clapping and cheering him on and running all over the place, and then he's at the finish line. Now, for my part, I just pretty much wait at the finish line. I'm not running all over the course trying to catch him. But he's coming down the stretch, and you can see him, and you're cheering. Come on, Miles, kick, run harder. Don't let him pass you. Catch the next guy in front of you. Come on, man, you can do it. Cheering him on. Picture Jesus at the finish line. There he is. He's encouraging you. He's calling you to keep running. He is telling you to endure, to keep it up, and to don't look back, and to don't quit, and to not to give up. And so that's our direction. We have direction. And the next lesson, at the next hour, we're going to talk more about that and about the direction we're going and what all of that means. Well, the third thing that I want to talk about for a little while has to do with determination. And Paul uses an expression here, I press. I press. I press means literally to run swiftly. Dr. Thayer writes in his dictionary on Greek words that it is a word that is used metaphorically with the idea, he says, of eagerly and earnestly pursuing something. And so to say I press, it's not something casual. See, it's not a hobby. It's not something that, we can take it or leave it. You know, there are a lot of things in life that may be nice to do, but if it happens, fine. If it doesn't, fine. That's not the word there. This has to do with an eagerness, an excitement that a person is pursuing, moving ahead towards something. Wiersbe says that the Greeks use this word to describe a hunter, eagerly pursuing Olympic runners. And so the whole idea expresses this determination, this fortitude, and this persistence that has us moving forward. Now, think about this. Again, where's Paul in his life? He's an old man. Oh, did I mention this? Where's Philippians written from? A Roman prison. A Roman prison. Now, you think about that. If you're advanced in life and you're in prison, you might think there's not much you can do. But there was plenty that Paul could do. He had guards 24/7, and they had different shifts. And so depending on the number of guards, it might have been as many as 16 guards in a 24-hour period. They would come in, they probably rotated shifts. It wasn't the same ones every day. You know what Paul was doing? He was sharing the gospel with them. He was talking to them about Jesus. You say, now, Ken, you're kind of making that part up. No, not really, because Philippian letter tells us that the gospel had gone to the palace through the Praetorian Guard. And so Paul had shared the gospel with some of these guards while he's in prison. And so no matter your circumstance, no matter your age, no matter the restrictions that you may have where you think you can't do much, you can press. You can be eager and earnest and excited and pressing toward the prize, even if there are things that are holding you back. When we lived in Tampa a number of years ago, there was a lady in an assisted living home. Her name was Doris Andrews. Her husband was one of my mentors, Paul Andrews. Some of you may know that name, a gospel preacher, preached in Tampa many years. And Doris was in the assisted living. Well, what can you do in assisted living? One time we went to visit her. She had the best attitude. How are you doing? She says, I'm doing great. She said, I've got everything I need right here. You know, you go see people sometimes, they're complaining and moaning and groaning that they're not in their home and they don't have this and that. And she says, what great opportunities. Every day I get to talk to people about Jesus. I said, really? She says, well, when they assigned me a table and I sit with other ladies, I said to them the first day, I give thanks for food. Can we give thanks when we have our meals? And they say, yes. So every meal she would give thanks. And there'd be gospel meetings where she'd been a member, and she'd get flyers, and she'd pass out flyers to them. Some of them were able to get out, some were not able to get out, and have devotions. And so there she was, and she was crippled bad with arthritis. I mean, her fingers were like that. In assisted living, she wasn't ever going to get out of there, but she was pressing on toward the prize. That's the idea here. Regardless of our situation or circumstance, you can be old and you be in a Roman prison and facing death, but you can still be determined to press on. One writer put it this way. He said, keep on running, even when you've had a fall. The victory wreath is won by him who does not stay down, but always gets up again, grasps the banner of faith, and keeps on running in the assurance that Jesus is the victor. I like that. And then another, you may recall from my time here that I have an author that I think a lot of, and he's very prolific. His name's Anonymous. He's written in church bulletins a lot of things. You read Anonymous. Anonymous said, running is not about being better than someone else. It's about being better than you used to be. This is true of the Christian race as well. You know, I was talking about cross country a minute ago. In cross country, and a lot of people don't know how you score that and so forth. But, you know, Kenny always had a thing with his runners. It's not necessarily that you come in first or second or in the top 5. It's bettering yourself. And it's having a personal best, a personal record. And so he looked at his little son Miles, and every race that Miles has run this year, he had a personal best. And so he's to be congratulated for that. He got better. Now, he never won. He never come in the top 5. I don't know what his best place was. I mean, you have 200 runners. You might come in number 20 and be pretty good. But he did a personal best each time that he ran. And so that's the idea here. Through our determination that we're determined to do our personal best and to be the very best that we could be. When I was working on this lesson, and I do research, and I went to a blog that I like called The Preacher's Word. Oh, some of you know The Preacher's Word. Okay. Well, you know, I find it kind of an ironic thing. Sometimes I will Google something that I'm looking for an idea, and what will come up in Google is The Preacher's Word. It's kind of hilarious. I said, did I write that? And I'll look at that. I guess I did. So I looked for determination, and this came up from The Preacher's Word. So I thought it must have been pretty good if Google thought it was good. And I'm just going to read to you what I wrote some years ago about determination. In a wishy-washy world, too often influenced by pop culture and political correctness, and tossed about here and there by the waves, and carried about by every wind of doctrine and trickery of men, Ephesians 4:16, we need Christians to be people of determination. Determined disciples are driven by God's purpose, 2 Timothy 1:9. Committed to His cause, 2 Timothy 1:12. Motivated by His love, 2 Corinthians 5:14. Unwavering in our ministry, 1 Corinthians 15:58. And resolute in the values we embrace and the priorities we pursue, Matthew 6:19-34. Such determination combines the qualities of decisiveness, dedication, devotion, and doggedness. We need determined pastors who will feed the flock, watch out for the souls entrusted to their care, chase the wolf away, and tend to the spiritual work given to their oversight and leadership. Acts 20:28-32. We need determined preachers who will preach the Word, the whole counsel of God, not what is wanted or popular, but what is needed at the time. 2 Timothy 4:1-2. Preachers, as D. Bowman once wrote, who will storm the will. We need determined parents who will raise their children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord, Ephesians 6:4. Teaching them godly values, instilling in their hearts a love for the Lord, and leading them by example in the way of righteousness. We need determined young people who will seek their Creator in their youth, Ecclesiastes 12:1. Flee youthful lust and keep themselves pure, 2 Timothy 2:22. Honor both God and their godly parents, Ephesians 6:1 and 2. And we need determined Christians to rise above the putridity of this wicked world, 1 John 2:15 through 17, to be transformed instead of conformed, Romans 12:1 and 2, and to be steadfast and immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, 1 Corinthians 15:58. Now, Ben, I just gave you a mini sermon. That's a whole sermon by itself. But that's determination. That's what determination is all about. Now, I'll tell you what determination will do. Determination will drive us to withstand temptation, to endure Satan's assaults, to overcome adversity, to defeat inordinate desires, to break hurtful habits, to remain calm during turbulent times, to hold fast to our faith, to fortify our hope, to love the unlovable, to de-escalate conflict in relationships, to weather the storm of unpleasant circumstances, to deny selfish ambition, to bear our own burdens, to grow in Christian graces, to develop the fruit of the Spirit, and to remain faithful unto death. I had a plaque that hung in my office when I was here, and now it hangs in my office at our home in Florida. And it's some words by our 30th president, Calvin Coolidge. And it says this: nothing in the world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education alone will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent. We need determination, like Paul had, to say, regardless of what we face, I press. I press. And then the last thing we want to talk about is the idea of discipline. Now, those that attended the teen devotion last night, you're going to get a little extra shot of this, because that's what we talked about last night in the few minutes we had, is the idea of discipline. Running requires discipline. Discipline to be in training physically, but also discipline mentally and emotionally. When I was in high school, my junior year, I attended a very small country school, and 3 of the little country schools in central Indiana consolidated to become a bigger small school. They were still small by Indianapolis standards. But all those little schools had good basketball teams in Indiana. And I was a little concerned that I'd make the basketball team. You know, height's not everything. And so I found out the basketball coach was going to be the cross-country coach. And I'd never run competitively. And so my junior year, I went out for cross-country. Well, the first day, Coach Short wanted to see what we had. And back then, cross-country, when I was in high school, this is back under the old law, by the way, it's a long time ago, okay? But it was only a 2-mile race. That's how long cross-country was, 2 miles. So he wanted to see how far we could run. And so he just set us out to run the course, see how many times we could run the course. I couldn't even run the course once. I wanted to impress the coach, and so I promise you, I gave it everything that I had. And at about 1.25 miles, I just collapsed over on the ground on a hot August Indiana day. I won't describe the effects that came from that, but if you run, you kind of got an idea what was happening to me physically. You know, yeah. Wasn't a pretty sight. By the end of that cross-country season, I was running 10 miles. Why? Well, Coach Short had us lay off of the Cokes and the candy and start eating better. Fitness, health, right? That's a good thing, eh? Yeah. And then we started doing interval training. And for cross country, sometimes we would run 4 4-footers and try to run them under a certain time. Or then we may do a distance. So through the whole course of just about 2 or 3 months, I'd gone from not even being able to run 2 miles to run 10 miles. That's training. Now, if we can do that physically, why can't we do that mentally and emotionally and spiritually as well? But it takes discipline. If I hadn't pushed myself to do the things the coach asked me to do, I wouldn't have been any better off 3 months later than I was that first day. But I had to discipline myself to be able to do that. And so Paul talks about this, and this was our text in the Devo last night, where he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty, thus I fight, not as one who beats the air. But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I preach to others, I myself should become disqualified. And so Paul uses again the language of the runner. And so how many texts have we looked at this morning? 3 or 4 already that employ the language of the runner. I was at a church one time years ago, and some of the brethren complained that I was using too many sports analogies in my sermon. I said, well, they must not like the Apostle Paul, because on every letter just about he's got sports analogies. But be that as it may. They probably said, you're not Paul either. But be that as it may. Here's another example of the sports analogy and of the runner and the discipline that it takes as you're running the race. And just like it takes that discipline in running a physical race, it takes the discipline to run the spiritual race. Thomas Huxley said the most valuable result of all education is the ability to make yourself do the thing you have to do when it ought to be done, whether you like it or not. It's the first lesson that ought to be learned however early a person's training begins. And it's probably the last lesson a person thoroughly learns. Gladys Brooks observed, discipline is demanded of the athlete to win a game. Discipline is required of the captain running a ship. Discipline is needed for the pianist to practice the concert. Only in the matter of personal conduct is the need for discipline questioned. And that is so true. John Maxwell reminds us that if you desire to rise above the average in any endeavor, you have to be willing to be disciplined. And then I love this quote from the first man who scaled Mount Everest, Sir Edmund Hillary. He said, it's not the mountains we conquer, it is ourselves. And then one more, Samuel Johnson, the 18th century British writer, said, he that would be superior to external influences must first become superior to his own passions. That's what it takes in Christianity. We got to be superior to our own passions. We've got to conquer those urges within ourselves and not do the things that we would want to do. In Galatians chapter 5, Paul contrasts the flesh and the spirit. And he said they're contrary one to the other, so that you cannot do the things that you would do or wish to do. And that's right. My flesh may have an emotion, a desire, a thought to do a thing. And maybe I intellectually realize, I know I shouldn't do that. I know I shouldn't go there. I know I shouldn't run with that crowd. I know I shouldn't watch that. I know I shouldn't think that. But then we rationalize and we say, well, I'm only human. Well, you and everybody else, we're all only human. But God calls upon us that we might be different, that we might discipline ourselves and not do the things that our flesh tells us to do, to be led by the Spirit and to produce the fruit of the Spirit and not the works of the flesh. One marathon runner said, long distance running is not a sport for people who crave instant gratification. Well, that's not only true in running, that's true in Christianity. If you want instant gratification, the Christian race is not for you. And so then, let me suggest 5 important considerations that I just want to bullet here for you that will help you with discipline. One is to realize the time we have to discipline ourselves is limited. Paul said, look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but wise, making the best use of your time, because the days are evil. Use each day that you've got to discipline yourself. And then you got to know the rules, you see. And we know that's true in any sport, whether it's football or basketball or baseball or running. You got to know the rules. And Paul said an athlete is not crowned unless he competes according to the rules. Well, you got to get out the rule book, right? And follow what the rules are and discipline yourself accordingly. A third thing is talk regularly to the coach. You know, even pro athletes a lot of times have personal coaches to coach them, to help them with their shooting or whatever it is. They talk regularly with their coach. Well, I put that in quotes because I'm talking about prayer. I'm talking about talking regularly with the Lord. To pray without ceasing and cast our burdens and cares and requests upon Him. And then to keep our eyes upon the goal. And we already read from Hebrews chapter 12 about fixing our eyes on Jesus. He's the author and finisher of our faith. And then we need to be able to exercise and train and eliminate obstacles. And we're going to have an entire lesson dedicated to dealing with some of those kinds of obstacles. And so there you have it, pressing toward the prize. It's going to take devotion and determination and direction and discipline. And unless we begin there, the other 5 lessons we're going to talk about are probably not going to be as helpful as they could be if we don't begin with this foundation and basis. I want to close with a true story. When I read this, and you may have said this, I've said it many times in preaching, that the Christian race is not a sprint, it's a marathon. But then I got acquainted, my son had given me a book on ultra marathons and about this guy that ran across Canada from one end of Canada to the other, which is pretty incredible. And then I got to read about some other these ultra marathons. So ultra marathons, if you're not familiar with that, are hundreds of miles. Hundreds of miles. And so here's a story about, true story, you can Google it. Check it out, this is not a preacher story. About an ultra marathon held several years ago that was from Sydney to Melbourne, Australia, which is 543.7 miles. Get that 0.7 in there. It's the world's longest and toughest ultra marathon. It was actually 1983 that 150 world-class runners converged on Sydney for this event. On the day of the race, a man showed up, 61 years old. He was a potato farmer and a shepherder named Cliff Young. He approached the registration table wearing overalls and galoshes over his work boots. Well, first, people thought he was there to watch the race, but to their surprise, he said, "I've registered for the race and wanted his number." They thought he was crazy, but Cliff had grown up on a farm without the benefit and luxuries of things like horses or four-wheelers. And when the storms rolled in, Cliff would head out to round up his 2,000 sheep over his 2,000-acre ranch. And sometimes he had to run for 2 or 3 days to round them all up. Well, the staff looked at him and issued him number 64. He mingled with the other runners at the starting line, and they were kind of looking at him, at the side of their eyes, and the spectators were kind of snickering, said this must be a joke. Well, the gun went off, and the other runners took off, and they were in their nice outfits and running shoes and running clothes, and their sculpted bodies were sprinting off. And there went Cliff. He began to run, not like other runners. It could be described, this writer said, as a leisurely odd shuffle. And off he went, in last place. Well, pretty soon all of Australia was riveted to this live telecast watching this scene unfold. One of the broadcasters says, "Someone should stop that crazy old man before he kills himself." For 5 days and 15 hours, and 4 minutes later, Cliff Young came across the finish line in Melbourne and won the ultra marathon. He didn't win by just a few seconds or even a few minutes. The nearest runner was 9 hours and 56 minutes behind. Australians were stunned. It's impossible. How could this have happened? Well, everyone knows that running an ultra marathon was you run basically for 18 hours and you have water breaks and stuff along the way. And then you stop at a designated place and you sleep for about 6 hours. And so you repeat that routine. You're out for 18 hours running and water breaks and so forth, and then you sleep for 6 hours. Well, no one told Cliff that. He never stopped to sleep. He just kept going, day in and day out, and he broke the previous record. When I read that story, I went, yeah, that's the Christian race. It's an ultramarathon. It's not just a marathon, it's an ultramarathon. And I tell you what it reminded me of, ladies and gentlemen. It reminded me of good brothers and sisters I know that sometimes kind of shrink back and they say, well, you know, I just don't have the Bible knowledge of this brother. Or I'm not as good a cook as this sister. Or I can't teach the little kids class like she can. Or I don't have the eloquence of our preacher. Or I don't have the leadership skills of our elders. And I'm not just, who am I? And they feel like they're just kind of shuffling along and they're not doing very much. That doesn't make any difference. That doesn't make any difference. You keep shuffling along. I don't care where you are, how slow you're going. If you will keep shuffling along and you follow these 4 points, that you're devoted to the cause, you're determined to finish, you know where you're headed with direction, and you have the discipline to keep on going, you can be like Cliff Young. And your friends and your neighbors and your relatives and your co-workers may snicker at the very idea of you getting up and going to church, of reading your Bible, of having values and being dedicated, but you just keep shuffling along. Don't ever give up. Don't ever give out. And don't ever give in. Keep pressing toward the prize.